The most brutal variations of castration ever recorded in some empires, men didn't just lose power, they lost their bodies, not in secret, not as punishment alone, but as policy. Across places like ancient China and the Ottoman Empire, this wasn't rare. It was systemized. Men were deliberately altered to serve, to obey, to become something else entirely. And the most disturbing part? Many of them didn't resist because in some cases, this was the price of power, status, survival. But behind that system were methods so extreme, they don't just shock you. They make you question how far humans will go when control becomes more important than humanity. So the real question is, how does something like this stop feeling wrong and start feeling normal? To understand how something this extreme became normalized, you have to shift your perspective. In many ancient and medieval societies, castration wasn't viewed purely as cruelty, it was seen as control. A calculated way to remove threat, reshape identity, and create individuals who could be trusted, or at least, who were believed to be easier to control. One of the most well-documented systems existed in ancient China, where castration was directly tied to power structures. Men who underwent the procedure often became court eunuchs, servants within the imperial palace, who, because they could not produce heirs, were considered safe to work closely with royal women and the emperor's inner circle. But the process itself was anything but controlled or humane. In many cases, the procedure involved the complete removal of external genitalia, both the testes and the penis, in a single act. There was no modern anesthesia, no sterile environment, and no guarantee of survival. Mortality rates were high, infections were common, and the recovery process was brutal. Those who survived were expected to carry proof of the procedure with them, preserving what had been removed as evidence of their status. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a permanent mark of transformation. And yet, despite the risk, many chose it. Why? Because within systems like imperial China, becoming a eunuch could offer something rare: access, power, influence. Some eunuchs rose to incredibly high positions, advising emperors, controlling information, even shaping political outcomes. It's a paradox. One of the most violent transformations could also become a pathway to authority. But not all cases were tied to opportunity. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, castration was often imposed, particularly within the system of royal courts and slavery. Eunuchs were placed in positions such as guarding the imperial harem, again, based on the belief that they posed no sexual threat. But the methods used varied, and some were even more dangerous than those in China. In certain regions, the procedure was carried out in stages, or in ways that increased the likelihood of survival for transport, but not necessarily long-term health. Many did not survive the journey or the aftermath. Those who did were often brought into systems where their lives were tightly controlled, their identities reshaped entirely around service and obedience. And then there are accounts tied to punishment. Across different cultures and time periods, castration was used as a judicial penalty, particularly for crimes related to sexuality or betrayal. It was meant to humiliate, to deter, and to permanently alter a person's place in society. Unlike imprisonment, which could end, this was irreversible. A lifelong sentence carried on the body itself. What makes this even more unsettling is how public some of these acts were. In certain cases, the procedure, or its aftermath, was intentionally visible, serving as a warning to others. It wasn't just about the individual. It was about reinforcing a system through fear. But brutality didn't always come from the act alone. It came from what followed. Survivors often faced lifelong complications, physical pain, hormonal imbalances, loss of strength, and social isolation. Their voices changed, their bodies altered, their roles in society redefined. In many cultures, they existed in a space that was neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected, useful, but never equal. And yet, despite all of this, these systems persisted for centuries. Which forces a deeper question: how does something so extreme become accepted? The answer isn't simple. It lies in the way power structures justify themselves. When control is prioritized above all else, actions that would otherwise seem unthinkable begin to be reframed as necessary. Over time, they stop being questioned. They become tradition, policy, even expectation. And once something reaches that point, it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge, because it's no longer seen as brutality, it's seen as order. But this is only part of the story, because some of the most extreme variations weren't tied to courts or systems of governance. They came from places where control, belief, and identity blurred in even more disturbing ways. And this is where the story becomes even more complex. Because not every instance of castration in history came from punishment or forced control. In some cases, it was tied to belief, devotion, and identity itself. Take the case of Origen, a 3rd century scholar who, according to early accounts, chose to castrate himself. Not out of coercion, but out of interpretation. He believed that denying the body could bring him closer to spiritual purity. Whether every detail of that story is accurate is still debated by historians, but the symbolism is undeniable. This wasn't about power imposed from above. It was about control turned inward. And that's what makes this chapter of history so unsettling, because it shows how deeply ideas can shape human behavior. When belief systems become absolute, even extreme physical acts can be reframed as meaningful, even necessary. But not all voluntary cases were rooted in religion. In parts of Europe, particularly between the 16th and 18th centuries, young boys were sometimes castrated to preserve their singing voices. These individuals, known as castrati, became famous for their unique vocal range, powerful, high, and unlike anything else at the time. Figures like Farinelli rose to extraordinary fame, performing for royalty and elite audiences, but behind that fame was a difficult truth. Many of these boys did not choose this path themselves. Families, driven by poverty or ambition, allowed or pushed them into it. The procedure was often done in secrecy, outside formal medical settings, and carried serious risks. Those who succeeded became celebrated, but many others were left in obscurity, dealing with lifelong physical and emotional consequences. Again, the same pattern emerges. An extreme act justified by opportunity. And then there are cases where castration was used as a direct tool of domination in conflict and conquest. In various historical accounts, it appears not just as punishment, but as a way to send a message, to demonstrate total control over the defeated. It stripped individuals not just of physical capability, but of status, identity, and legacy. Because in many cultures, masculinity was tied directly to lineage, inheritance, and social standing. To remove that was to erase more than the body. It was to erase the future. What makes these variations so difficult to process isn't just their brutality. It's their diversity. There wasn't one reason. There wasn't one system. Across different regions and time periods, castration took on different meanings. Punishment, loyalty, purity, opportunity, control. Different motivations, same irreversible outcome. And yet, despite how extreme it sounds to us today, these practices were often accepted, sometimes even respected. Within their own contexts, They were embedded into systems of power, belief, and survival. Which brings us back to the core question: how do societies come to accept something so irreversible? Part of the answer lies in normalization. When an act is repeated, structured, and justified over time, it begins to lose its shock value. It becomes part of the system, and once something becomes systemic, individuals within that system may no longer see it as a choice, but as a reality. Something that simply is. And that's where history becomes uncomfortable, because it forces us to recognize that human behavior is not fixed. It's shaped by context, by power, by belief. The same species capable of building civilizations is also capable of justifying acts that, from another perspective, feel unimaginable. So when we look back at these practices, it's not just about understanding what happened. It's about understanding how, because once you understand how something becomes normalized, you start to see patterns. And those patterns don't always stay in the past. If this story made you pause, that's exactly the point. Because history isn't just about facts. It's about confronting the realities we'd rather not see. If you want more deep, thought-provoking explorations into the darkest, most hidden corners of human history, the parts that challenge what we think we know, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because the deeper you go, the more you realize history doesn't just reveal the past, it reveals us.